It's time to tier list. There's a cat now. Buddy, get your butt in a reasonable place, please. Well, here we are. So, like I talked about in the video that was kind of a preview to this that I put out the other day, I think that the metagame is a lot less dominated right now by a few strong options. I think that right now there are a lot more possibilities for building team comps than there have been in the past. That brings with it more complexity, and I wanted to try and reflect that a little bit in the tier list here, because there's a lot of weapons that I'm not really ranking relative to each other that much. There are, definite categories here, but this is a very big one, the orange one over here. And there are just a lot of viable weapons, I think. And I think that, like, any of these weapons that I've put in this tier, you can absolutely see in top-level play, and that it has a role that it can play in that situation. Let's get started by explaining the first tier here. You're probably running two of these. If you just look at the top-level play that has been posted publicly in the last few weeks. So there's an Area Cup that got played in Japan. There is Mode Cup. There is the SWC qualifier, the Splat World Championship qualifier. In any of those events, you look at a team comp run by a top team. You're probably seeing 2 of these 6 weapons on that team comp. I can't tell you which ones they're going to be, but there are going to be 2 of them in all likelihood. These are weapons that just show up very disproportionately, and they're weapons that have very clear strengths that the teams are building around, which are all very different, but tend to play off each other within this tier pretty well. That said, this is not like, previous metas have been, where you can kind of prescribe what a meta comp is probably going to look like. Back in Crab meta, 2 splashes, some number of sloshing machines, any space that's not one of those 2 weapons is probably Splatana Stamper. And you just can't say that of the way that the game is played anymore. There are a lot more options available. There are a lot more tactics. So here's what I'm thinking is kind of the core of the Splatoon metagame right now. We'll start with Ballpoint. A lot of people are putting Zap ahead of Ballpoint. I'm putting Ballpoint ahead of Zap. I think that Inkjet is a special that opened the game up in a really big way once it got buffed. It was an answer to a lot of problems that there were in the metagame. It made it so that you had the ability to move in with an aggressive special against a team that had something like a crab tank, against a team that was prepared to back up in response to you. If you think about it, an Inkjet is out for a really long time. Like, very much in the same way that a crab tank is just taking a lot of space for a really long time, so is an Inkjet. You have to stay out of the way of an Inkjet for a pretty long time, and the Inkjet has the ability to look over the top of stuff and take a lot of people out. Something I'd like to point out is that right now, there is only one special in the entire game where every single weapon that has it is being seen at top-level tournament play, and that is the Inkjet. We're seeing Ballpoints, we're seeing vanilla Tri-Sloshers, we're seeing Rapid Pros, and we're seeing Annaki Novas. And I think that says something in part about the kit synergy that those few weapons have, but also something about the special. Inkjet is just kind of a universal, you can get in and start a fight if you have one of these on your side special. There are some weapons that definitely pose a threat to the Inkjet, and you have to be careful about those. But it's mobile enough that you can generally play around it decently well, as long as you know what the good positions are and where your opponents are. There's counterplay to the counterplay. So that is really strong. The Ballpoint Splatling is just an insanely powerful main weapon. Back when it was first released, it was just completely overpowered, and granted, it did get nerfed after that, but the ability to sustain fire at that range is still good. It got nerfed a little bit. That wasn't a huge nerf. It's still one of the best weapons in the entire game. Zap. Zap is the primary tacticooler weapon in the game right now. There is also Tri-Nouveau. So a lot of the time, even if you aren't running a Zap, you are still running a tacticooler because you have the Tri-Nouveau. The Zap gets it significantly faster than the Tri-Nouveau does, in exchange for a little bit of fighting power. It's got a somewhat less useful bomb for spamming, and its main weapon isn't going to be quite as, I don't want to say useful in a fight, but more like reliable and high damage in a fight. A Zap, if it's going to splat you, it's going to be because it committed pretty hard to that engagement. Especially a Tri-Nouveau, drinking its own juice, is probably good with just getting a trade, and that's all it's looking for, and it hits you twice, and that's all it needs to do. And it's one of the easiest things to hit you with in the entire game. Zap is a lot more precise. It's still definitely very scary as a fighting weapon. Like, you cannot underestimate the fighting power of an N-Zap, especially one that doesn't care about its own life because it has Tacticooler. But it's always been just a little bit slower to kill, just a little bit like too many shots you have to hit that are pretty precise while it's moving around quickly. Moving quickly makes it a little bit harder to hit those shots. But then they buffed its accuracy. And to be clear, I love buffing accuracy on weapons in a lot of cases just as a concept in general, because I like for there to be a higher skill ceiling, that you're not just kind of throwing things at the wall and hoping one of them sticks with your shot, so that they are actually going where your reticle is intended to aim them. I do not think that this is a weapon that needed that accuracy buff to be able to stay viable. That accuracy buff made it significantly more scary in an engagement because fewer shots are going to miss. And that, on top of the fact that it was already seeing use because of the earlier tacticooler buffs, has only moved it further up the tier list. This is a lot of people's choice for the very best weapon in the game. It's a little bit of a deviance that I have put it in second place. I put it in second place in part because I don't think that Tacticooler is critical to run on a competitive team. I think there are alternatives that do not use Tacticooler that can still win. You can still play, I think, a control-oriented comp, and something that really benefits from a control-oriented comp is having the Ballpoint, which can play that control play style from a distance, but can also just inkjet in and get everyone in when it actually wants to move forward. I think the Ballpoint is better at doing everything than the Zap is. The Zap, it doesn't have a tool to really force its way in, per se. It's a tool that really enables its teammates, so it's a little bit harder to evaluate the impact that it's having. One other reason that people might be putting the Ballpoint a little lower is that the Zap is the go-to weapon for doing what the Zap does. With the Ballpoint, you have a slew of other options as a Splatling player that might fit into the niche, depending on what your team needs. I don't care a whole ton about the placement of all of the Splatlings relative to each other, because if you're a Ballpoint player, you can probably also play Nautilus pretty well. If you're a Ballpoint player, you can probably also play Heavy pretty well, and it's not like you're really weighing any of those weapons in a vacuum. When you take on a Splatling player and you ask them, hey, can you go Heavy Deco? They can probably go Heavy Deco. They can probably do that just fine. Because you've got all of those options, on one hand, you might say, well, that means the Ballpoint is weaker, right? Because sometimes you might want the other options. But if all of the mechanics carry over from one to the other, then isn't it more of a strength that if you play Ballpoint, you can also get all of these other niches available? So I don't know. I don't think it's especially important which of those two are the best, but those two are definitely some of the most common weapons that are being played at top level right now, and for very clear reasons. The Slosher, the V-Slosher, has just been... Everybody's been switching to this thing. There are so many weapons that used to have I know a lot of people who play various different weapons that aren't even particularly related to the Slosher that are now picking it. It's just a general frontline option right now, which is interesting. It feels kind of like it's replaced Machine as the go-to AoE weapon, and since so many people were just picking a go-to AoE weapon, that's where they're going to. Having the bomb is really nice. It can poke from a distance. One of the big things about this weapon, though, is how well it shuts down short-range shooters. That and the Nautilus are two weapons that are in the meta right now, in large part because the short-range shooters got buffed and everyone's using them and considering them. And these are two weapons that have the range and slaying power to really ruin a short-range shooter's day. So that fighting power is a large part of why it's being seen so much. It's been really well proven in tournaments. This is something there's a lot of data to see is really popular right now. So definitely, bucket mains, you do have a weapon that is really powerful right now, and I suggest you use it. Splattershot got massively buffed by the last patch. Not only did it get its shot spread improved, but it also got its special improved dramatically so that it's a lot more reliable now. There were people at top level who were saying that the special felt reliable and consistent even before they made it go from 40 damage to 60 damage on splash. But now that it's 60, it's reliable for anybody. This is one of the more annoying specials to have to deal with right now. You just constantly have to be keeping track of when the shot has their special. Because they're a short-range shooter. They're going to get it pretty quickly. They're going to get it really reliably. And when they have it, they're just going to pop out of nowhere from half the map away and delete you if you're not already moving. So that's really hard to deal with. That's something that counters crab tanks really well. That's something that, anything in this game can get splatted by a Zuka. There are a few things that make it a little harder, but it's always something that you have to have an escape plan for. So that's a pretty powerful frontline option right now, and it fits well into a lot of comps because it's not super reliant on its teammates to do anything else for it. Splash is as low as I've ever put it on a tier list right now, and probably for everybody else as well. This is not because the Splash-o-matic is a bad weapon by any means. It is because there are so many things now that counter crab, and that other people are used to countering crab at this point. So crab tank has to deal with Inkjet, it has to deal with Tri-Strikes, which are, pretty popular right now because of the bucket. It has to deal with the Trizuka, and it has to deal with Stampers, which have a ton of object damage and shred you really quickly and can hit you from pretty far away and can also zip through your crab. On top of that, you've also got stuff like the Tri-Slosher, which you can slosh up over the top of it. You've got the Nautilus, which can shred the armor. There are a lot of things that are really dangerous to a crab tank right now. So much so that a lot of people are starting to feel like when they're popping it, they're not getting as much value because it's just getting bullied out so hard by everything else that the enemy team can throw at it. That being said, there are still absolutely maps where you see it. I'm still seeing occasionally a top team going for double splash and trying to play those old strats from earlier crab meta. It's a really powerful control-oriented weapon. If you're not running a Zap right now, you're probably putting a splash on that comp because the crab tank is a special that's going to allow you to kind of either stall out or, zone out, just kind of keep players off you when they're trying to rush in at you. Because a Tacticooler isn't something protective in the sense that it's stopping the players from getting splatted. It's just something that's an insurance policy in case they do. And so being able to hold your ground against that rush is really powerful against a Tacticooler, and that's something that a crab tank can kind of help you do. It's got the DPS and the staying power and the armor to withstand an onslaught of multiple players running at it. And if its team follows up, it can make it very difficult for those players to get anywhere and actually get anything done before they get sent back to spawn. The Stamper is probably the most controversial pick that I'm putting up here this high. I still think that this weapon is really, really strong. We're seeing so many people use it. We're seeing people run it instead of a Splatling. And while the quick respawn playstyle has been starting to fall out of favor, Tetras are lower than they've been in a while. A lot of people are putting them significantly lower than I've got them on this tier list right now. And it's becoming less popular. I still think that this weapon works even if you're not just trying to run in and feed with it, just because of how powerful it is at zoning and drawing the enemy team away from what they're trying to look at. If you're trying to label a weapon as a skirmisher, which I've warned you shouldn't, so this is the weapon that you're looking at. This is a weapon that can attack you from heavy splatling range with just a single chunk of damage that's a pretty big hitbox and is going to do 70. So that combos with burst bombs, that combos with all sorts of things. And it can also combo on its own charge slash with its own horizontal slash, which has an even bigger hitbox. The damage that this thing can threaten with is really dangerous and really easy to combo off, and you can hit it from so far away that it's difficult for a lot of weapons to deal with. As soon as it's occupying a sight line, you need something to move it out of there. And then if you're not paying enough attention to it, it just comes to you with the Zipcaster, and now you do have to pay attention to it. A mechanically strong Splatana Stamper player, I think, can absolutely just solo main this thing on any team that it wants to and have success doing it. And I don't think that's really changed in this patch. It's fallen out of popularity a little bit, but I would still, if someone on my team wanted to solo main this weapon, I am never going to tell them no. The next tier down I'm calling very strong puzzle pieces. These are weapons that can absolutely do a phenomenal job at top level, but they need to be with a comp that supports them well. And I would even say that for some of these, there are some map modes you probably don't want to consider them for, as we get lower down the list especially. I wouldn't say that for the top end of this tier, but as you get down further and further down, there are definitely some considerations to be made. We'll start with the Nautilus. I don't care too much about the Splatlings because I think that if you're able to play one of them, then any of these four, the Ballpoint, Nautilus, both of the heavies, could be the right choice, and it just depends on your personal preference and what the team needs. So I'm not worrying too much about how I would rate all of those four relative to each other. If you've got one of them, you've got all of them on your team, and you just pick whichever one you think is most appropriate. The Nautilus has some advantages in that it can push forward more aggressively. It's got that kind of short-range ability, the charge hold that the Ballpoint doesn't have, and it can also mark areas to spot players out before it pushes around somewhere, so you're not going around a corner blind. If you're trying to run something with point sensor, you're running this weapon. If you want the ability to mark the enemy team, you're running this weapon. This is the one that's going to get you that utility. And it's a very powerful slaying weapon that doesn't really need its sub to support its combat, and wouldn't really be able to use it that well even if it had a good one. Rain is never a bad special, especially on the maps that are as skinny as the ones we have. So it's a really solid option, and if you're considering an anchor weapon that's not a Ballpoint, Nautilus is one of the highest ones on the list that you want to also be considering. It works really well with more aggressive comps, especially the kinds of things that would use Tacticooler, because it can move forward and fight with them. It's not going to get stuck on the back line playing a snipe position where it can't see the fight that's taking place. It's going to be able to get up there and slay. It's not going to be able to start its own fights. It's not a frontline weapon, per se, but it can absolutely get close enough that it can help the frontliners the vast majority of the time, in contrast to a longer-ranged weapon that might just have to play its range in some situations and stay out of those engagements. The Tri-Sloshers are paired next to each other, again, primarily just because if you've got one of them, you've got both of them. Inkjet, like I said, very, very strong. If you want a second inkjet and it's not coming from a ballpoint, it's probably coming from this one. There are some other ideas. One consideration with this Tri-Slosher is that you're not going to get a lot of those inkjets at all. There's just not that much paint you're going to get from this weapon, especially when its main weapon's playstyle is to trade a lot. But an aggressive weapon loves an inkjet because it can come up from underneath the ledges that this weapon is already sharking under anyway and just delete someone from existence before they knew you were there. The Tri-Nouveau is the alternative option for Tacticooler that most people are considering, although, as we'll see later on down this list, there are some other ideas as well. The Tri-Slosher is a really powerful main weapon. It's just really reliable at trading and getting those like consistent, easy splats that some other weapons need a little bit more finesse to be able to get that might not be quite as reliable in tournament conditions. It has fizzy bombs, which are really, really useful for being able to spam. That's something I didn't even really talk about with the ballpoint, but being able to spam a choke point with fizzy bombs is really valuable right now. Being able to bomb a choke point out is really valuable right now. You'll notice that, Zap and Slosher and V-Shot all have these lethal bombs, and that's a big factor in this. Because, and this is more speculation on my part, but I would think one of the reasons that these are as popular as they are right now is that if you're going to be running up against a lot of Tacticooler comps, you want to be able to fill the choke points with those bombs so that those players can't move forward even though they've got the Tacticooler. That's a powerful defensive option for them. So there are a lot of boxes that the Tri-Nouveau checks, and if you want any one of those pieces, it's honestly a good thing to consider. But all three of them being together makes for a very usable weapon. If you want a Tacticooler, say, on like Flounder Heights, this is a great way to get it because you're getting the double value of having a bucket on a map like that, and also the Tacticooler, which is going to be valuable there too. Carbon Deco, we've seen that this is a totally viable, incredibly powerful option, and we have only seen it from Volti. That's oversimplifying it a little bit, but in terms of top-level major tournament play, Volti is the only person who's actually taken this to the level that to its highest potential, and I shouldn't just be crediting Volti because it's also the rest of the team that's doing it. But I still think that it's up here. I still think that there's just a chance that a good Carbon player gets a quad every time they go in for an engagement, and you need to play so carefully around this. So that despite the fact that it can't really paint for itself and needs its team to do all of that for it, the value that it's going to get from being able to slay is just really invaluable. And on top of that, they just buffed Trizuka. And this weapon has Trizuka. So I already had this up pretty high on previous tier lists. Now it's just kind of nuts. 52 Gal. Killer Whale is really unpopular right now. Like, people are putting it lower than I personally think it entirely deserves. But I can see why it's not as huge of a priority. Like, it does apply some pressure to the enemy team to force them to move, specifically. It's not a huge tactical nuke. It can counter crabs, but it's definitely something that the crab can play around, and it's temporary enough that the crab is going to outlast it. So, it's a mediocre special, is what I would say. It's definitely not something that you're picking this weapon exclusively for. I do think that the combination of the main weapon, which is up there, in my opinion, with the Slosher and the Nautilus for its ability to shut down short-range shooters, especially paired with the wall that it's got, I think it can fill very much a similar role to those other two weapons on a comp, in terms of how it's going to take fights. It's much less of an anchor than the Nautilus is, and the Slosher has AoE, which is probably the reason that those are being prioritized over it. But if your whole goal is just, I want these short-range shooters to not exist, this is an option for you if you have a shooter player and you want to turn them on their own kind. And so I'm not going to put this too much lower than this, honestly. I think that it absolutely does have a place in the metagame, maybe more so than what it's been played in so far. But there are definitely people who are trying it and making it work in certain situations. The Tetras and the Wipers, this is not a playstyle that I have opted into too much. And so the rushdown, quick respawn playstyle, it's not my forte understanding it. I think most people would probably tell me to put the Wipers above the Tetras. I'm just kind of lumping them into this kind of general area here because that's what this whole tier is anyway. These are things that you can fit in, and it kind of depends on what you're looking for. Do you want that rushdown and you want something that's going to paint a little bit more? Maybe you go for the Reef Slider Tetra. If you are ready to work around a Zipcaster, or there's a good map for that, then maybe you put that Tetris player on the light Tetras. And I'm going to put them right next to each other because if you've got a Tetris player, they're going to know how to play both. And then Wiper, if you want the aggressive version of it, the rushdown Tetris playstyle, you're going to play this vanilla one. The Deco Splatana Wiper is a little bit different because it's much more of a support. It's much more of like a zoning style weapon than it is a rushdown. It's not going to use that mobility to get in super deep into the enemy base and get into annoying positions. It's more there to take up space and to get relatively consistent missiles output. If you're running missiles right now, you're running it on the Wiper Deco. So if that's something that you want on the comp, like I've seen people running like multiple mains of special charge on this weapon. That's not to say it gets it particularly quickly, but it's being preferred over something like the Flingza, which would paint for them better, and the REEF-LUX, which would paint for it much better, in part because its main weapon can actually fight, and that the beacons are definitely still useful. So these weapons definitely took a little bit of a hit, it seems, on this patch, maybe more so the Tetras. So those are my thoughts. That's, again, not my forte. I would probably, look to someone who plays the Tetras or the Wipers and to get a little bit more from them about exactly where they would place them. But I do feel comfortable that they are at least in this range here, in this tier. Where they are relative to the others in the tier, I'm a little less certain. Heavy Deco, this is, in my opinion, the weapon that you want to play if you play a Kraken. There are some people who will disagree with me and say that they think it's the 96 Deco. This is my opinion. The Heavy Deco is a really powerful main weapon that you can put on a player who you definitely have on your team because friggin' everybody and their mom is playing the Ballpoint. So if you really want to do that like Kraken cheese on Clamblitz, then this is probably the way that I would think to do it, to put that onto your comp and play a bunch of weapons that can follow up really well on the Kraken. Because you don't just want the Kraken to go in by itself. You want the Kraken to be able to have follow-up or to distract in a way that the team can push someplace else. But one of the nice things about Kraken that is very similar, actually, to the way that it kind of worked in Splatoon 1 is that the Heavy Deco can put itself into more aggressive positions by krakening to those positions. There are some places where it might not have been able to get through because of an enemy sightline it had to cross. But if it crosses that sightline with the Kraken, now it's safe. It's being used, it seems, a little bit less as a panic button, just because there's a little bit of startup time on the Kraken. But you do have that available if, like, you're about to get jumped on and you don't want to jump out for some reason. So, there's that. Sloshing Machine is a really powerful idea of a weapon. Thing is, its fire rate nerf definitely hurt it a bit. It hurts its paint output. It hurts its ability to fight. It's way easier to rush down now, and that's harder to deal with now that there is a lot of Tacticooler in the meta. And a lot of short-range shooters. Like, anything that can get on top of the Sloshing Machine and make it dead quickly is a huge danger to the Sloshing Machine. So, it's still being seen. It's still the best Booyah Bomb weapon in the game. So if you want a Booyah Bomb, that's the one you're going to. but it's also seeing stiff competition from the Slosher. And there are some situations where strikes are just kind of straight up better than the Booyah Bomb. Like, if we're playing tower control, I would prefer strikes to a Booyah Bomb, because the strikes are going to keep the tower nuked for a much longer amount of time. Lot less of an ability for the enemy team to, avoid the special and then get back on the tower in an overtime situation where they're trying to keep the timer ticking. Speaking of tri-strikes, the Tentatek and the Neo Splash, I'm putting in about the same spot. I do think that the T-Tech's extra slaying power is worth considering, especially since it got the accuracy buff that's going to make it so that fewer of those shots miss. Having the inaccuracy that the Splattershot had was a problem for it, because its fire rate is just a little bit slower than a lot of the other shooters. It's slower than the Splashes, it's slower than the N-Zaps. And so your shots missing was a bigger deal with that weapon. Now that that's been ironed out quite a bit, it's a stronger slaying option than it was before, and I think it's able to step more into the niche of, this is the version of support that paints for tri-strike that you want if you're trying to have it be able to run in and fight, rather than just paint for more strikes than you would actually be able to get with a slower painting weapon. I think it's closed the distance because of that buff towards the Neo Splash, and I'm comfortable just putting them in the same tier and in the same spot or so. Both of them are still totally workable, and it depends on what your comp wants. The V-Dualies are one of the best weapons that are just never seeing any use right now. I still think that this weapon is outcompeted for its niche by the Splash. There is a niche that it has in that it can dive into enemy ink better. The thing is, I don't think you need to do that. I don't think that that's something that... You can build a comp around that sort of dive, but, why hard commit 2 rolls into enemy ink when you could just throw a burst bomb at someone? Another huge weakness of this weapon is that it's not able to take advantage of the lockdown that a burst bomb has before it pops the crab. A suction bomb will still have an impact on where the opponent can stand, but its much longer fuse time makes it a lot easier to avoid. You're not locking someone in place by throwing a suction bomb at them, the way that you are if you hit them with the burst bomb and paint their feet and make it so the Explo shot that you fire at that player is going to combo. So it's a worse user of the crab tank. It's not going to get the crab tank as often, and what it's giving you in return in its extra range and the slaying power that comes with that and its ability to dive into enemy ink, I just don't think that that's worth the trade-off. So I think that this weapon is outclassed, but if if a top player uses this weapon, they're absolutely still going to be able to play at a top level. It's not like this weapon is a problem for you to choose or anything like that. It's just because there's a better version of it up above on the tier list, it's probably just not going to see a lot of use, and I don't see that changing particularly soon. The E-Liter is a very niche option, I think. People just talk about, oh, that's an E-Liter map, and that's kind of how it goes. On an E-Liter map, this weapon's disgusting. It can just see a sightline and be like, if you walk into that sightline, you're just down. And there's not a lot you can do about that except to wait until I've fired a shot and then run for cover as soon as you do. It's a weapon for slowing down an enemy team that's trying to rush in, which can be really valuable. But you have to be very consistent with your shots. There are certain map modes where it's just really hard to find a good angle. And so because you can't just reliably pick it pretty much anywhere, that knocks it down a few pegs as well. 96 Deco, I think that this weapon's fire rate is definitely getting to the point where I'm not a huge fan, because it's not going to paint as much, and it's going to be a lot more aim intensive. But the problem is you can't aim very well with this thing. So it's going to rely pretty heavily on its wall to make up for the fact that it's just going to randomly miss shots sometimes. When it does get in good position and have good aim, it can be very difficult to fight against. And it is one of the other options you have for Kraken. It's either this or the Heavy Deco. I would not go with anything else for Kraken right now. But this is a weapon that gets it, and it's a weapon that is pretty well positioned to be using it. And once it's in a safe position, it can put up a wall and try and hold that position after the Kraken is over. So it's definitely something to consider. It's a lot more popular in Japan right now than I think it is in NA or in Europe. But it's usable. The Annaki Nova is... It's basically, if you want maximum output of inkjets, this is the one you're going for. The Ballpoint can absolutely get inkjets very fast, and it's on a very strong main weapon, a much stronger main weapon than this one has. But this has a slightly better inkjet output than the Ballpoint does. I think partly just because the Ballpoint is going to spend some time charging, and partly because it's going to be firing some shots at players a lot more often than the Annaki Nova is. The Annaki Nova is just here to farm that inkjet. And so it's going to get more of them. It's kind of the arrow spray to the Ballpoint's sloshing machine to a lesser degree. It's going to put out a lot more of that special. And sometimes that's something you want, because sometimes what's getting you in a retake situation is that inkjet. So if you just need a steady stream of those, this is an option to go to. And it's been shown to see some success at a top level. I don't think that it's the best option for every situation. I personally am perfectly happy to just have a Ballpoint instead of this. This is starting to get to the point where I'm a little bit dubious about its use in a variety of situations in top-level play. But it has been played, and it has been played successfully, and I have to give it credit for that. Squeezer is an absolutely insane main weapon, but it suffers from a few issues. Number one, it is not going to get its Zuka very fast compared to the Splattershot, and so if you're picking it for the Zuka, then the Splattershot is the better choice. For another thing, this is a weapon that physically injures people. Having to mash the ZR button is not something that a lot of people are willing to learn to do. So this weapon sees a lot less play simply for that reason, for accessibility's sake. And for the last thing, it could really use a bomb. It could really use something to poke with from outside of its range, something that it can put out there to have control of an area for longer than its shots will be there, something that's not line of sight. The fact that there's no AoE option here whatsoever, except for maybe like hitting a Zuka shot around the over the top of something, is really hurting this weapon a lot. So there are just a few things that take it down from this would be in the top tier to if you've got a squeezer specialist, you can make it work. Z+F Charger, the extra range of the E-liter helps in a lot of situations. And since there are other options for tri-strikes that are pretty popular, that are going to get those tri-strikes faster generally than a charger will, there are a lot of other things that are competing pretty heavily with this weapon. But there are definitely some cases where it's been used successfully. I think that if you're in a situation where you have a charger player and you want tri-strikes and there's nothing else that everyone feels really strongly about wanting to play, or everyone else like has another role in the comp already, then absolutely, just put them on the Z+F. Like, that's not a problem, even at a top level. So I think that's something worth considering for sure. Snipewriter has had a bit of a renaissance recently. It saw play in, I think, an area cup in Japan. And all of a sudden everyone was like, wait, this is working. I get it. This thing kind of works. Here's the idea with the Snipewriter. It outranges Ballpoint, and it has Tacticooler. And it paints pretty well. And that's about it. Those are all of the nice things that I can say about the Snipewriter. There are a lot of problems with this weapon, but those three nice things are pretty nice. And so, if you're trying to specifically counter an enemy player's Ballpoint, and have a Tacticooler, and be able to do both of those with the same weapon, that's a pretty convincing argument to run it. More so than anybody was willing to make for it up until that point in time, for sure. V-Heavy. V-Heavy is not seeing a lot of use, not because it's not good, but because there are so many other Splatlings that are very, very good that people are generally tending to prefer. But there are a few use cases where you really do want that Wave Breaker. One of them is if you're up against a bunch of Dualies, because Dualies hate Wave Breakers. Wave Breakers require you to jump. Dualies want to be able to roll, which is a purely ground... Dualies want to be able to roll, which is a grounded thing. And so, unless we're talking about, like, Dualie Squelchers, which are going to try and maybe jump tech over the waves, it's really hard for them to deal with. And so having the Wave Breaker can be valuable over the other options available. It's just a really solid backline weapon that I don't think is going anywhere anytime soon, but it's also not bringing anything so unique that the ability to use Inkjet or have such sustained fire as the Ballpoint has aren't worth passing up on it for. Inkbrush. Inkbrush is in a little bit of a rough spot, again, because of the maps. I think if we have bigger maps, that the Inkbrush is a much more powerful option, but it's just hard for the Inkbrush to find its way in sometimes. The range is definitely not ideal. If you're using this weapon, you really need to be flanking, you really need to be sneaking up on someone, forcing them to look at you. But its special has really great synergy with it. This is one of the killer whale weapons that's up here on this list. And it has a bond that it can poke with if it's not able to get in and use its range. So if you're a brush player, this is the one you're probably playing. And, you know, I don't have too much more to say after that. It's definitely not something that top players are prioritizing, but if you're a brush main, like if you play just like Inkbrush, Octobrush, this is probably the version of it that you're getting the most use out of. The blasters have made a little bit of a comeback on recent patches. The Rapid Pro Deco and the Rapid Deco have been kind of creeping up there a little bit. And we've actually seen significant V-Blaster use recently. Part of it, I think, is that we're starting to really value AoE a lot. AoE damage is something that works really well against Inkjets. AoE damage is something that works really well against crab tanks. And I think that AoE works really well on tower. Like, there are definite places on maps, any given map, where an AoE weapon is going to have a very significant advantage. I'm surprised V-Blaster in particular is coming back right now. They haven't really buffed Big Bubbler that much, and this is something where the Big Bubbler really needs to do a lot of work to enable it to get in. One thing we have seen, though, is a really interesting combination of Tentabrella and V-Blaster, where the Tentabrella launches its shield, and then the V-Blaster sharks in using the shield. And it can use the shield to just take one-shots exactly the way that a Tent does. It looks very similar doing it. Or it can also just use it to pop the Big Bubbler further forward than it would normally have been safe to do so. And now it's able to use that Big Bubbler as an aggressive kind of forward base and start taking people out from there. So there are definitely some more ideas with this thing now. But I am surprised that it's seeing as much use as it is. My thought on this is that maybe people are trying it out now that they have seen it work once. I haven't seen so much from it that I'm like, oh yeah, this is, you know, better than it was before. It might be that people are rediscovering it and being like, hey, maybe we didn't give this a fair shot before. Or maybe people are actually finding more uses for it. But, I mean, if you put this in good hands, like, it's a very powerful slaying option. It's something that's going to splat a lot of players. The question is just, can you put up with the lack of paint? And can you put up with having a Big Bubbler in one of the precious special slots on your team? You've already got so many really good specials that it's difficult to justify passing up on. You've got the Inkjet, you've got the Tacticooler, you've got Tri-Strikes, you've got Zuka, you've got Crab Tank. All of those options are insanely powerful in the metagame right now. You've also got missiles. Rain has never been bad. Like, Booyah Bomb would be fantastic to have. So, like, taking one of those and considering the opportunity cost of going down to what some people are now claiming is the worst special in the game, in the Big Bubbler, it's hard to justify. But people are definitely doing it. Range Blaster has never really left the weapon pools of top-level Japanese teams. I never feel comfortable putting this all too low because we just keep seeing it overseas so consistently. It's definitely got its issues. It's obviously very slow. The fire rate is abysmal. It's not going to paint very much at all. So it has to play incredibly safely. But that much AoE and that much range, combined with a pretty solid kit, it's able to, bomb people out. It's able to get Wave Breaker, which is not something anyone's ever complaining about having. And it works. You just got to plan your whole team around it and make sure that there's plenty of paint so that it can actually function. Because if this can't paint, it's not going to be moving anywhere anytime soon. That's one of the other issues with the Blaster, is that it wants to move forward quickly, and it doesn't have the tools to facilitate that by itself. A lot of the other frontline weapons you're looking at can paint for themselves, and that means that they can get forward really quickly and smoothly. The Blaster, as it's moving forward, it's just painting for itself. It cannot paint escape routes very well for itself. It cannot fill up the map so that the rest of the team can get in there. It's not going to get its special very quickly. That lack of paint really hurts it as a frontline weapon because moving forward is your job on that weapon. So it really puts the onus on the player to be getting splats specifically, because that's what you're providing for the team. Okay, the next tier down, I'm calling borderline. This is a tier of weapons which, it's a combination of different reasons why something ends up here. Maybe it's seeing use, but I'm not convinced. Maybe it's just super duper situational and you don't want to use it everywhere. Maybe it has potential, in my opinion, but that it's untested, that not enough people are even trying to use it for us to really know exactly where it lies. So REEF-LUX, to start with, is the go-to weapon if you just need massive missile output. The thing is, that's not a thing that people have been prioritizing, but it does paint insanely well. So if you want massive missile output and insanely good paint for combat reasons beyond just being able to get the missiles, this is an option. And top teams have occasionally gone to it in extreme cases to fill big holes on their team comps. Bamboo is something that I think is really under-considered right now. It's kind of a brick wall of a weapon that's in Splatoon 2, it was very, very good at shutting down the short-range shooters that were trying to run at it. It's so hard to get in as a short-range shooter against a Bamboo. If they can hit their shots, you just don't get to approach them because their fire rate is too fast. And yeah, they're not going to one-shot you, but they're going to hit 2 shots before you get in range. So you just kind of have a lot of trouble pushing this thing. And again, I think that Killer Whale is maybe just a little bit undervalued right now because I think it works pretty well, especially on a backline-ish weapon, something that's going to be aware of what fights its teammates are taking because it's behind them and it can see them really well. If it can't get close enough to take the fight, it can just pop a whale and aim that at someone. Or it can aim that whale at a backline weapon that would otherwise interfere. It is going to struggle against backline weapons. I feel like this weapon just has a really hard time against something like an E-Leader. It really has to take cover against it. It does not have a lot of tools to use against something like that. So there are definitely some counters to it. There are some ways around it. But I think that it absolutely can function pretty well in a lot of places, and I'd like to see more experimentation, especially from the people who are using it in Splatoon 2. Like, y'all have the ability to run a weapon that's this difficult. In Splatoon 2, the Bamboozler was considered a meme weapon for a long time. And then, all of a sudden, it got used in a tournament by, I think the team was called Prophecy at the time. It was Char's team, but they underwent like 3 different name changes, so I don't remember exactly when this happened. But They ran it before it got the MPU buffs and were able to make it work. And then it got the MPU buffs and everyone was using it. Like, this is one of those weapons where we think it's a meme and then suddenly, like, someone in Japan uses it and everyone loses their minds over it. That happened in Splatoon 2. I'm curious to see if something similar ever happens in Splatoon 3. People are more aware of its existence and are more interested to try it now, so maybe that's something that will help it in future, but I think this thing works. And I'm putting my money where my mouth is because I am now on a team with a player who's trying to make Bamboozler work. So we'll see what we can do with it. Flingza Roller. Again, I'm in this position where I feel like this weapon is really freaking good and that it should be getting used more often than it is, but everyone is preferring the Wiper Deco. I'm just like, I need more data of people trying to use it to really be willing to drop it any lower than this. I'm willing to put it in the borderline tier because we're just not seeing it used at all, and lots of people were using it at one point in time. That has to mean something's driving them away from it, but man, it just seems so good on paper, and the ability to like let the team in with the missiles, the ability to paint really well for itself, the AoE ability to hit up over a ledge and go aggressive if you need it to. It's just got so many tools, and we're not seeing it used at all, so that's where it ends up. The vanilla Jet Squelcher is a weapon that I have not seen outside of Japan, but Japan really loves their ink vacs, and that's the reason we're also seeing the Rapid Pro up here. Japan, I don't think they ever really gave up on ink vac per se. I mean, there was crab meta where nobody was running anything other than that sort of comp, but they were definitely sticking to ink vac and making it happen in more map modes and more situations than the West has ever been trying to. But now that the ink vac got buffed, I think the West is starting to actually take notice of that and reconsider their stances on it. I still think that the ink vac is a near bottom tier special, but the fact that it's not holding the weapon back as badly as it used to, that you can actually make some set plays with that ink vac, is definitely worth considering. The ink vac is going to protect you in ways that it didn't used to with the hitbox buff, and the extra size of the shot making it a little more difficult to run away from isn't hurting it either, although that was not the part of the weapon that really needed any extra help. It was more so making it so that the vac itself didn't die first. And that's really what I think has been more significant that's been buffed about it anywhere recently. But Jet Squelcher is not a bad main weapon at all. It paints a lot, and it's got decent range. It can follow up with a lot of different weapons, but it can also move forward better than a hard backline like an E-liter can. And now that its special isn't the most absolute garbage, terrible thing ever, I could definitely see it just getting some use. But I want to see Western teams attempt it more or say more about it, about why they're not using it, before I'm willing to put it lower or higher than here. It's kind of in a limbo area. Rapid Pro, again, it's never been a bad weapon. We've got a bunch of copies of this thing up here, and it's always just been its kit holding it back. And now that its kit is holding it back less, it's worth some consideration at the very least. And that's about all I have to say there. S-Blast had one stalwart representative in Chara. Chara has since turned his back on the S-Blast. I don't know that there was really anybody else who was trying to use this that much. It does not feel like it was given a lot of reps outside of Chara. Maybe, it's something that didn't work for Last Resort but would work for someone else. I'm still not certain that I want to drop it super duper low, because I do think that its big AoE radius and its ability to swap between that radius and the long range shots is invaluable. But right now, a lot of people are actually preferring the range blaster to it. And the kit is definitely not helping its case at all. Sorella Tent is potentially viable. We're seeing where I see this used is generally there are a few like Brella players or Tent players from previous games or I would say previous patches if this had ever been viable before. The people who have just always wanted to play Tent are starting to pull this out in tournaments and making it work. Thing is, they're Tent specialists, and one of the things it took was a massive buff to Trizuka. So it's not like the Tent is in a great position right now, but there are places where it can be used now, and it's starting to see that use. And we're seeing it more often in Japan, I think in part because Japan bans fewer maps. On Mincemeat, a Tent is really annoying. It's one of the few things that can actually push across top mid that forces all of your backliners to do something about it. And, anywhere that's got really nasty choke points like that, the Brella can absolutely abuse. So I think in that sort of a context, definitely something you can totally run. We're just not seeing it quite as much in the West outside of people who were already diehard Tent or Brella players, because this is the closest that they've ever had in this game to having a viable weapon in that class. Mini Splatling. This is a weapon that is seeing way more play in Japan than it is in the West, which is really interesting. And it might be because of maps, like we talked about before, where, again, narrow corridors tend to be on bad maps, and the West tends to play fewer bad maps. But, Hammer's pretty good there in those tight spaces. And this is a weapon that controls space pretty well. It's got a decent kill time. It has burst bombs, which are valuable for a lot of different reasons, and lets it have mobility to get out of places if it needs to. It can kind of play like a discount Nautilus in terms of like aggression, but one that also paints really well. And if you particularly want hammers, it's honestly one of the better options you've got besides the V-Wiper. So I put it in here. Again, it's one of those weapons where we're seeing it more in Japan, and not anybody is really trying to push it in the West. But I could see it having some tournament results if people were to really attempt it. V-Charger is up higher now, again, because of VAC. We're still not seeing a lot of this being used, I think, again, because the E-Leader's extra range is so powerful. But it is a thing that we're seeing more of, and it's for that reason. Octobrush. I think that Octobrush definitely has a lot of aggressive potential. I think the challenge of it is fitting it into a comp and justifying running it over a Stamper for the Zipcaster. There are definitely a lot of other options that a top team is probably going to think to go for before they go for the Octobrush. So it's something that you're probably running if you're a brush one trick. And if you are like a brush one trick and your team wants a Zipcaster, that's a use case I can see. But that's not a use case that's going to come up a lot in top level play, and we don't have a lot of data about it. Squiffer. Squiffer is, again, held back a little bit by the Big Bubbler. I don't think that it's the most phenomenal user of the Big Bubbler. I think Big Bubbler is more valuable, honestly, like, unless you're using it on tower, the most valuable use case I can see for Big Bubbler is using it to push forward, using it to take an advanced position and put the Big Bubbler around it so that you can actually hold that position instead of getting forced back as soon as the enemy team starts shooting at you. And that forces them further back, and that lets your team move up, and that gets you a little bit of extra space on the map. And the Squiffer's not in a great position to be able to use that. The big thing with Squiffer is just its main weapon is actually pretty strong. If you can hit stuff with this reliably, a Squiffer is going to just be really difficult for the enemy team to deal with because it has a pretty decent amount of range and it one-shots fairly quickly at that range. And that's always going to be dangerous. So if someone's cracked, they can make it work. But it's not bringing a lot in the kit department, and it's really, really reliant on player skill to make it work. The custom jet has not been seen as much recently. It kind of seems to me like a paint bot, and paint bots are not super popular. Paint bots just don't bring quite as much to a fight. They're just a little bit slower. They're a little bit more reliant on the rest of the team to push up with them. The Jet Squelcher, the V-Jet Squelcher, can facilitate a push by, admittedly, ink vacking, which is not the most, reliable way, but it can actually get people forward better, I think, than a very slow-moving ink storm will help people get forward. And so I think that that's probably why we're seeing a little bit more of the V-Jet than we are of the C-Jet right now in top level, but I still think it's up there. It's seen use before, it's been tried, and there have been some niche cases where it worked. So, what we're not seeing a lot at top level, and what I might have a little bit too high right now, is the Tri-Stringer. The Tri-Stringer did get significant buffs in the most recent patch. Like, significant enough that I can't drop it down too much lower than this, because being able to get that extra damage combo makes it so it's just going to splat people more often. And that has to count for something for it. But it's definitely getting outcompeted by a whole bunch of strong backline weapons. Like, Ballpoint is right here. You got E-leaders to watch out for. And while it can kind of attack those from off angles in ways that they can't attack it, it also isn't really likely to one-shot any of them. It really wants to be comboing off of other teammates' damage. And if it's shooting at something that its teammates can't reach, it might just not be able to do all that much reliably. It's also not got the most stopping power, and part of that is the paint. It doesn't paint an awful lot, and sometimes you can just, see the arrows, see where they land, and go someplace else, and avoid the shots entirely before they explode. So, it needs a little bit, I think, but even just buff this thing's paint, even just give it maybe a slightly larger explosion rate, I don't know, some kind of buff, whatever buff you decide to give this thing. And I could definitely see this suddenly seeing a massive uptick in use. It's really close. It's just not quite there right now. So, for the time being, I'm kind of in this kind of middle area here with it. Okay, Zimmy. Zimmy has a lot of synergy with its kit. It's really difficult to play the tower against an enemy Zimmy, and it's also really difficult to defend the tower against an enemy Zimmy. And the mini Splatling is a very solid main weapon, as we've established. I think that, a little bit of a big bubbler buff, and immediately this is seeing use again. It's just, again, big bubbler has not been a priority for a long time, so I can't put it too much higher than this. Explo, I think, absolutely works in some map modes and definitely doesn't in others. It's something where if you get exactly the right map mode for it, it's something you have to respect. But also, again, there's just so many other backline weapons that are seeing use over it right now that it's hard to justify maining this solo at a top level of play. You're probably focusing more on Splatling's Chargers kind of thing than you are dropping down to something like this as a backline weapon right now. Big Swig Express, it paints a lot. It's got a pretty good special, and that's usually, at least good for mid-tier. We're not seeing a lot of use out of this right now, but the ability to two-shot is a massive improvement, but you're still two-shotting with a roller, which is definitely not ideal. You can one-shot with particular circumstances if you're close enough with a relatively slow swing time. But that's not Carbon Deco levels of threatening by any means. It just feels like if you really, really need the paint, there are some other options that paint and also do other things. So I could see it slotting into a comp occasionally, but we're not seeing it used very much at all. Slosher Deco might be a little too high. Yeah, I don't feel good about putting Slosher Deco above Zap 89. We'll put this up here and then talk about it in a second. So Slosher Deco, again, the main weapon is a great source of AoE. The kit is not this kit. If you're playing a bucket, you're playing this kit right now. And if you're playing Zipcaster, you're probably playing this or this or this before you're playing this. So it's like, on paper, it doesn't seem that bad, but it's outclassed extremely hard. Zap 89 is an interesting case because, on one hand, I still think chumps feel to me like they went from being 2/3 of a special to being like 3/4 of a special. Like, it's not that big of an improvement to them, but you do kind of have to respect them a little bit more. They do a little bit more of what they were intended to do. It's just that's not quite as much. But even on previous patches, there were some cases where double orange zap could actually kind of combine to make a decent push. Because 2 sets of chumps out on the ground is kind of difficult to deal with. It's kind of like launching a single set of missiles that are well aimed. Like, again, it's not quite there, but you can see that if they buff this any more than it already is, it could get to the point where it's basically missiles. So, Zap is, it's got a buff recently, it's got a lethal bomb, and it's got the chumps, but this guy's up here. This guy gets one of the most important specials in the game right now. And this guy gets super chumps. I take the Tacticooler every time. If you do really want super chumps, this is probably, in my opinion, the weapon to go for it. This is my first choice if you're looking for a super chump weapon. And I think it's a weapon that can push up and fight inside the super chumps pretty well. I think that it has really good synergy with the autobomb and the super chumps, that like putting an autobomb inside there, sometimes people don't see the autobomb, or sometimes the autobomb lets you see better through the chumps than your opponents can see through the chumps. It gives them a lot that they have to deal with. So I don't think it's a bad weapon. I just think that it's a little bit outclassed. It is like a solid kind of mid-tier right now. That brings us to these guys, which are all over the place on people's tier lists right now. Because we're seeing it in Japan, and people have not been trying them all that much in the West. If you just look at all of the different components of these kits between the custom Dualie Squelchers and the vanilla Dualie Squelchers, if you take those in a vacuum, I think Lethal Bomb, Wave Breaker instead of Super Chumps, obvious better choice. One thing that people have pointed out that I agree with is that the ink efficiency is a big problem for the V-Dualies, because they need a lot of ink to be able to jump tech. And wasting so much of that ink on a single bomb is so infrequently worth it that they don't get as much value out of a splat bomb as basically any other weapon in the game's going to. Is that enough to convince me? Well, I mean, you see that it's here on the tier list. One of the things that I'm looking at is just that people are not using this one as much as they are using this one. And there is some synergy here between the kit that we have to take into consideration as well. The custom Dualie Squelchers have beacons, which are a great sub-weapon for a weapon that doesn't want to use its sub-weapon very much. The exact same thing was on the Ballpoint Nouveau in Splatoon 2, and that was a great pick for it, because it could just use its beacons and then not have to worry about pressing the R button anymore, and use all of that ink for the main weapon instead. The beacons also follow up really well with its skirmishing heavy playstyle, where it's trying to get into positions that are annoying and kite back and kite back and kite back and waste the opponent's time as they try to get back past that location, and threaten to jump teammates in if the opponents don't deal with the beacons. So I can see it. I can see that part of the kit is really valuable for it. And the fact that it's seeing more play at a top level than the other kit is enough to make me go, okay, it seems like it works. I'm going to trust y'all. I'm going to trust y'all who are trying to play it. but I'm narrowing my eyes and squinting a little bit because I still don't think that this makes it on a top level team in the vast majority of situations. If they're planning for like a really optimized team comp. So those are my stances there. Everything from this point forward, I would not anticipate seeing very often in top level competitive play. At lower level competitive play, these can absolutely work. I think at top level, these have weaknesses that are going to start getting punished. And so in the majority of cases, I wouldn't recommend them, but there are a few cases where there are notable exceptions to that rule. And I'll kind of talk about that. Forge Pro, I don't think it has major weaknesses in the way that a lot of lower tier weapons have. I think it's just not doing quite enough with what it has. It's just not quite ink efficient enough it doesn't quite paint enough to get the special as often as you would like to have it. Its kit is just mediocre enough that you prefer other midline options over it. It's just kind of not quite setting itself apart from the pack. But I think that it's solid. I think that, like, you put this in the hands of a top player, and it's going to look dangerous. And if someone were to pick it in tournament and win with it, I wouldn't be tremendously surprised. I wouldn't be like, oh my god, they're geniuses. I'd just be like, oh, they're just playing a weapon that they're pretty solid on from earlier games, and that's a little suboptimal, but they were the better team, so it's fine. Kensel Luna Blaster. It works on Flounder Heights. That's all I'm going to say about it. Everything else about this weapon is really difficult to make work. But it has fizzy bombs, so it can clog up a choke point. It has hammer, and it can take up some positions, some narrow passageways with that hammer that are difficult to pass through and can really help force the team in. And it has that AoE that you really need from underneath ledges. I think that more people should try this weapon in the place where they're trying this weapon just to see if it's not going to give them better results. Because this... I want to put this down a step, maybe. Let me think about it. Do I want to put this down a step? I'm really tempted to put this into borderline. Fizzy bomb spam, like, bomb spam in general is being prioritized more these days, I think. And I think that's because, again, of the proliferation of tactical comps and short-range shooters in the meta, that it's something that helps to counter that a little bit. And fizzy spam is something that this weapon's going to want to do a lot because its main weapon isn't going to paint very much. And so that's a way that it can paint for itself. And it can also use those fizzies as sort of a pseudo-curling bomb to get it in. So it feels like there might be some potential that I haven't been allowing it. But I don't want to see anyone using this weapon in zones. I don't want anyone to be using this weapon in a situation where your paint is a liability. This weapon needs people to be painting for it, even though it's got fizzies. And it's this one and not the other Luna that I'm looking at here, mainly because the fizzies are going to help it paint in a way that its main weapon can't. And low paint is always a massive liability that needs to be offset with slaying power. So the relatively lower range compared to the other blasters, I definitely would, as a main weapon by itself, would put it below the vanilla blaster. It's just a question of, is the rest of the kit, really that much worse than the V-Blaster? This is something that might need a little bit more experimentation than I've given it credit for so far. Hydra. If a Hydra gets the right sightline, it's just going to get 3 people down in a 1v3. Giving it the right sightline is a big mistake, and it's something that a lot of teams are capable of just not doing. This weapon struggles against E-Leaders. It's not going to give you quite as much pushing power as the Ballpoint Inkjet is going to. This has fizzy bombs and doesn't really need to use its bombs that much. This one only has an auto bomb, which is so-so. Helps you spot some people sometimes, and it can be good for locating people. But if you're trying to play a Splatling and you want to locate people, Nautilus is right there. So I don't know. If you're gonna run a Booyah Bomb weapon, you're probably getting it from the Sloshing Machine instead. L3D, it's a decent main weapon sub weapon combination. It gets hammer. None of those things have really been buffed or anything recently. And if you're going to be running a hammer, like you're running that over, again, one of the more powerful specials, it's hard to think of a reason you want to use this over other stuff. It's not bad, but it just feels pretty mediocre to me. We've talked about vanilla Squelchers a little bit before. The fact that the maps are not very well designed for the skirmishing playstyle that it's trying to play most of the time. It's got ink efficiency problems with the bomb. And Wavebreaker is really, really solid, but it's not a top tier special either. So it's just, it feels kind of mid. If you're trying to draw people off the objective and waste their time with a mid-ranged weapon, you're probably looking at the Stamper instead. It's just so powerful from such a long range that the range that the Dualie Squelchers have just doesn't look as good compared to, you know, this weapon having that kind of range as well. Junior, it's got bombs and it's got paint, but that's not enough to carry a weapon. It needs to have like at least a really good special that's combining with those things. Because like in S2, the reason you ran this thing was to get a lot of armor. Well, it doesn't get armor anymore. It gets one of the worst specials in the game. So if the reason you were using it before was that special, and now it doesn't have that special, and that special is not doing well, this is a harder weapon to run. You can, again, play the aggressive bubble sort of play style, but this weapon just gets forced out really hard by a lot of frontline weapons. A lot of people, especially at lower levels of competitive play, will try to run a Junior like it's a frontline Slayer weapon. They'll try to run this as if they're playing like a Splattershot or a 52 Gal or even like a Wiper or something. And like, as soon as it runs into a Nautilus, as soon as it runs into a Bucket, as soon as it runs into a 52, as soon as it even runs into a Splattershot, it's just getting outranged so hard that it dies really quickly. There's some situations where it ends up in as a frontline weapon where other weapons could fight their way out of, and it's just too vulnerable with the range that it's got. So I don't think this is ever going to go really that much higher than it is, but the one exception to that might be if Big Bubbler comes back. If it's really valuable to put out a lot of Big Bubblers, this is a way that you can get those Big Bubblers really quickly, although you're also considering the Zimmy, and the Zimmy is probably the better of the two, if I have to guess, when we go back into a Big Bubbler meta. The Dapples, they have their strengths. Their dodge rolls are basically teleports functionally, especially with this game's netcode. So they're basically impossible to really react to. You really have to be predicting where the rolls are going if you're going to actually hit them afterwards very fast. And they have a really fast time to kill and a lot of object damage. Put one of these on the Rainmaker shield, you are just not letting the enemy team pop the Rainmaker. It's not going to happen. But the range, again, is just such a problem for them in the same way that it is for the Junior, that they're just going to get bullied by so many weapons that outrange them massively, and they're never going to get to use that really fast kill time to their advantage. They don't paint super well, but just because of how short range they are. One of them has Reef Slider. The other one does get cooler, but it doesn't have a bomb to be able to poke, and so unlike the Torpedo Kit, it's just kind of forced to shark in there and get on top of someone. And if you're painting carefully enough, especially if you're watching where the beacons are going down, it can be hard for them to get in. I think if you put Torpedo on the Tacticooler kit, now we might have a different consideration. That might be something that bumps it up at least a tier, maybe two. But as it stands right here, I think this is just not the kit for it. Neither one of these is the kit for it. One of these days they'll give the Dapples a good kit, and all of a sudden we'll have to respect it, but I don't think that day is today. Big Swig Roller, the vanilla Big Swig has some potential for like zones cheese, where it just paints like crazy and then gets a vac that denies the enemy team from painting and does that all game, and that's all it's trying to do, and it's not trying to fight. It's not really doing much more than those two things. But the Express is definitely the preferred kit in most cases right now, and there are a lot of vac options that are not so one-sided and predictable and bad at fighting as this one is. So I can't justify putting it too much higher than it is right here. This is honestly a high estimate, I think, if anything, but I'm willing to give it this much. V-Carbon, there was a work that I've cited a couple of times by Red Shell, where he says that he thinks there are some situations where this can be a valid alternative to the Octobrush for a couple of different reasons. And I trust that. That's someone who knows that weapon a lot better than I do. Nothing too much has really changed about either weapon in that time, but nobody's trying to use this thing either. And when you've got a big brother that looks this big, it's really hard to justify actually putting this on a team comp. Dynamo, I think, honestly, with Tacticooler being as strong as it is, maybe goes up a little bit. Like, it would have been in the tier below it if this were any other patch. Right now, with Tacticooler being as useful as it is, it might be a little bit higher. The ability to hit up over ledges and stuff is very valuable on some maps. And this is also a really good weapon at shutting down short-range shooters as they try to run forward. The problem is it's just really slow, and it's hard to take space with, and there are a lot of backliners that just outrange it and make it sad. Its hitboxes are relatively inconsistent. There are some times where you'll just go through a hole in the hitbox where you really should have died, but the game decided that it was going to miss for no other reason than that it put the hole in the hitbox there. And I think it could do a whole lot better than having a sprinkler. So that's about as high as I think it can comfortably be right now. Now we're getting down into a position where I'm like, I don't think this has a place in competitive play. There are definitely some strengths that some of the weapons in this tier have, but they're not big ones, and they're definitely outclassed by other things. Most controversial ones here are probably the Bloblobber and the Paintbrush. Bloblobber, I've played with a Bloblobber now in Splatoon 3 and kind of seen how it's playing. I've talked a little bit more with Isaac, the top Bloblobber player in NA, and thinking about how it fit into our comps, thinking about how it worked there, I'm just not sold on it. It seems like used as a support, it's not getting you quite enough value compared to other weapons that paint a similar amount. The painting buff definitely helps it fill this niche, but it wasn't even that phenomenal at painting. It wasn't like the sort of thing that's just going to get like 2,500 paint every game. It was a normal amount of paint for a support weapon. But the kill power is just really difficult to bring to bear. It can do a little bit of chip on players, but it's just not going to ever reliably splat someone unless you're sniffing them, unless you're that close. Because they can just move sideways relative to where the line of shots are going, and some of them are going to miss, and it's not going to do the full damage that's available. The Paintbrush, it got an ink efficiency buff, which is something that the weapon definitely needed. It's also just not great in my opinion. There are some positions where it's strong. You do have to respect the fact that the weapon can hit up over the top of ledges in much the same way that the Octobrush can. This is the way that people die to Octobrushes. They stay under a ledge while the Octobrush is up on top of it, thinking that they can't be hit. Because against most weapons, you can't be. But then it just sloshes down over the side and you realize, oh, this is just the normal kill time that a brush has, but at a right angle from where the brush is. And now I'm dead. And it has a little bit more range with which to take advantage of that. But its swing time is just really slow. The two-shot isn't necessarily the most, like, reliable thing. It's slower than a Tri-Slosher at getting its damage out, I believe. It just never feels like this thing can splat me fast enough if I get on top of it and it gets on top of me at the same time. And so I don't really know why someone's trying to use this in a competitive setting right now. I don't know what value you're getting out of this that you wouldn't get out of a lot of different things. Rapid, it gets Tri-Strike, which is a really good special, and it's not a bad main weapon at all. But I think you're opting in for the inkjet version of it, and so there's not that much of a reason to actually use this. I could see this going up even a tier higher, but there's just so little reason to use it compared to like what unique things these weapons will give you, and I'm like, this is probably a pass. We did actually see a top-level Ink Brush Nouveau in the Splat World Championships qualifiers. And Madness and Jared were like, wait, why are they running that? Why are they running that? They're just going to get comp diffed. And that's exactly what happened. The Ink Brush Nouveau was not able to get an awful lot done and got shut down pretty hard. And I was like, yep, that is exactly what I expected to happen with a kit like that. It has no way of getting in. It's getting stopped every time it tries to approach. And doesn't have anything to poke with. The hammer is too predictable because it's coming from too far away. Just lots of problems. Definitely wouldn't recommend this kit. If you're going for a brush, I'd probably say play any other brush than this one, even the paintbrush. Custom Junior is a weapon that seems like it works, and then you try to run it against a competitive team and realize that your torpedoes aren't hitting anything because they're constantly getting shot down, and you're basically just a paint bot for wave breakers. And if that's all you're doing, then you might as well paint bot for something that's going to be a little bit more impactful, like maybe a tacticooler. So definitely not a super powerful option right now, and while it's not bad either, I don't think it's going to see competitive use for a pretty long time. Nova. I mean, Annaki Nova is up pretty high. I was nice to the Novas then. I'm not going to be nice to this Nova. This is a Nova that you play if you want to opening Gambit cheese, or if you just always want to know where every single opponent on the map is at all times. But point sensors are also on this weapon, so why not just run that instead? It's another midline weapon that gets a special that's arguably better. Has the same sub. Paints a little bit less. That's, a fair assessment. And you know what I'd rather have painting than this? A weapon that has specials that are more valuable. A weapon that just straight up paints better. A weapon that's just straight up paints better that has specials that are more valuable. There are not a lot of great reasons to go for that. V-Tent is a little bit higher on the list than it has been in the past, in part because of InkVac being a little bit better than it was in the past, but you're definitely just using this Sorella tent if you're going to pick a tent, because Zuka is, it also got buffs, and it was a better special to begin with. So that's about all there is to that. GooTuber is still not seeing any use. I did find out recently, this is a siphon. It's a siphon pump. If you just look up siphon pump on Google Images, you will find something that looks incredibly similar to the GooTuber. So there's your trivia for the day. I hope that has made the GooTuber mains happy, because their position on the tier list is probably not a thing they're as happy about. It can throw torpedoes, and it can tap shot to either help in fights or paint for missiles, but this weapon can fight at a similar range or better with its tap shots than its tap shots. It also has a one-shot. Granted, it's a short-range one-shot instead of a long-range one-shot, but it has a much shorter charge time. It also gets missiles, and so it's just kind of outclassing this for every niche that this would be considered for. If you want a charger, you've got this charger. you've got this charger, you've got this charger, you've got this charger, you've got this charger, and all of those are probably preferable. Gloogadoolies. I don't really have anything new to say about this. I'm amazed that they have not touched this weapon. It feels like it really needs something. Like I've said before, fire rate is just too low. It doesn't paint enough and paint well enough for itself to be able to move forward confidently. So it's always stuck just kind of killing time, waiting for someone to blunder into its range. It's not going to get very many booyah bombs. So the fact that it has them is not as big of a deal for it as it is for other weapons. So it's just never had a great place in the game. I could see it being maybe a tier higher or something, but I wouldn't recommend that someone get into the Gloogadoolies unless they really, really loved the weapon. Sploosh is a very similar deal, where the Sploosh is a weapon that you need to build an entire comp around to really make it work. It can get in there and it can do rat things, but someone who knows that the rat things are coming, and especially has dealt with them before, knows how to deal with them, it's just so hard for this thing to get in. It's got the junior problem, but worse. It's very, very, very short-ranged, and it's just going to get shut down by so many other weapons. So, very challenging to actually make that thing work. Kraken Roller doesn't have enough poking options, is the big problem with this guy. It doesn't help that there's a really, really good ambush roller that's hogging all of the limelight, but the fact that it gets beacons makes it so that it has a really hard time actually moving forward. It really needs its team to paint for it. It can't do that by itself. It can't poke at someone from a long distance. It kind of just gets forced out of position as soon as it's seen. All it can hope for really is to be able to either, jump out or Kraken out if it gets into a tough situation. It doesn't really have quite as many options if it's being outranged by something. And as we've established, there are a lot of things that really like outranging short-range aggressive weapons in this meta right now. Same kinds of issues with the Splat Roller. The Curling Bomb is great for its movements, but the Big Bubbler is just not doing a lot for it. Like we've mentioned, it's not a very high priority special at the moment. It can fight within it pretty decently well. If you sneak this in somehow and it gets that big bubbler up, it's hard to get into the bubble and do anything about it. You kind of just have to give it space. So that's not too bad, but it's just not been seeing a lot of use at all. People are not really trying to push this thing. It feels pretty one-note. It feels too easy to punish. And again, just the multi-kill potential on the Carbon Deco is making it so that you look at this and go, okay, but why not the other one? L3, we've got same kinds of things that I'm going to say about the V-Pro, and same kind of thing that I said about way higher the V-Dualies, in that there's a unique synergy between the Splash-o-matic and specifically its Burst Bomb and the Crab Tank that this weapon cannot take advantage of. And so it is innately a worse Crab Tanker. And it's, the Splash farms a comparable amount of Crab Tanks. So you're basically passing up on a better fighting weapon, which has the Burst Bomb that combos with it, to have better crabs. This has a little bit more range, but it's a lot less reliable in a fight. Like, it's way too easy to miss those shots. Like, at a human level where you're not just aimbotting everything and hitting your 3 shots, it's not a great kill time. And even if you do manage to hit 1, 2, 3 and then the next one, that's still not a super fast kill time, just because of the amount of time that it takes to go from shot to shot. Luna Blaster doesn't paint enough, frankly. It's a huge, huge paint liability on the team. At least, like, the longer range blasters paint a nice, clean line in front of them. But this thing, it paints a spot in front of it. It's not a lot. And definitely not something that I tend to like to see on a competitive team. It's not going to get very many Zipcasters, so that's not super relevant to the discussion, but Zipcaster is definitely not one of the highest priority specials, and there are a lot of options we've already talked about, which you would probably go to if you are looking specifically for the Zipcaster. V-Pro, Line Marker has only been getting better and better, and so there's an argument that it should be creeping up a little bit. But again, it's just not got the same synergy with the crab tank that the Splash has. Yeah, you can maybe nail someone with the line marker and then try to pop crab for extra damage combos and stuff like that. But one of the big benefits of the burst bomb for the Splash is its ability to have AoE damage, the ability to hit up over ledges, the ability to like maybe even hit people around corners, the ability to paint people's feet more reliably. And this is just not super easy to do that with. Hitting a clutch line marker is not an easy thing to do either. And unlike something like the Rapid Pro Deco, it doesn't have quite the same range to follow up when it's marked someone. A mark is more effective the further away you can hit them from where they can hit you. And the Pro doesn't quite have that same sort of ability to just automatically follow up on something that it tags from E-liter range. The H3D is not doing too hot for any particular reason. The H3 as a main weapon is very, very aim intensive and can be sort of hard on the trigger finger. It's one of those weapons that tends to aggravate overuse injuries, and that's something I haven't talked about with the other Nozzlenoses, but so it's like not a lot of people are willing to even learn the weapon in the first place. Then on top of that, it's got like wall and bubble, which can help it hold some ground, I guess, and that's kind of what it's designed to do, and so maybe there's some kit synergy you could talk about there, but that's not anything that a competitive team is looking for right now. So it's just hard to use and for not much of a reason. The 96 Gal is a vac weapon, and that got a little bit better, so that's neat. Still has fire rate problems, still does not have a sub-weapon that's working super hard for it, and it's just kind of slow and clunky and doesn't have a lot to do. The Aerosprays are a little bit higher than I have put them in the past, because we have been seeing some capability of Reef Slider players to paint zones with them. So it's got that going for it. It doesn't have much else going for it. Its range is pitiful, and like we talked about with Junior, that makes it a liability where it's going to get picked off by a lot of other weapons that are in the meta right now. Gold Aerospray, same kind of deal. If you're getting Booyah Bombs, you're probably trying to get them from someplace else. It's going to get more Booyah Bombs, but that's the only thing it's doing for your team, and that's just not enough in this game. There were weapons in Splatoon 2 that you could just paint the map for the entire game and get a good special and use that special, and that was enough. I don't think that that's the way that Splatoon 3 works anymore, and so this ends up down here because that's all that is. Clash Blaster has a great kit and is just really not good main weapon. It takes too long to splat anything. The AoE helps, for sure, and you can use that from a pretty wide range away, but if you're looking for that kind of thing, the S-Blast now has a competing amount of AoE, and so there's not even that much of a reason to use it, because you can get all of that AoE without necessarily sacrificing the ability to shoot something at range or to one-shot something. So again, Zuka buff is going to help this a lot, but I still don't see it being used anytime soon. Sploosh Neo, it can do funny back cap strats sometimes, but it's definitely not the kit that you're looking for if you're trying to rat, because this has the curling bomb, which lets it move faster, and that's going to let it move into positions. This is only good at maintaining a position once it already gets it, and it has no tools whatsoever to actually get that position besides the main weapon, which is, even with the main weapon and the curling bomb, this struggles to do it, so this is going to struggle to do it even more. H3, Cooler is really good right now, but you know what I'd rather have as a cooler weapon? Literally every other cooler weapon in the game. So I don't feel like bumping this up particularly high just for that reason. If you're using specifically the H3 over something else right now, I don't know why you're doing that. Why not just run a Zap if you're looking for a support that's going to get cooler? Because the Zap can push in and fight. That Zap paints for more of those coolers. If you're really, really interested in a midline weapon that has a point sensor, why not go for this one? Again, problems with consistency, problems with potential injury. I wouldn't go for the vanilla H3 anytime soon. Splatbrella has continued to have problems with the Brella shield, but on top of that, it's just a mediocre amount of damage, a mediocre amount of paint, and a special that it can't use anywhere near as effectively as all of these Tri-Strike weapons up here that can throw bomb and then Tri-Strike, 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 bomb. It doesn't have that combo. It's still down here with, the usual suspects of the low tiers. Undercover Umbrella, again, usual suspect. The Reef Slider buffs have helped it. It has not made it an anywhere near viable weapon. It is still very, very easy to shred the shield on this thing. You just throw like a bomb or something and then someone else will shoot it. In a coordinated setting, it's not going to be able to last very long against a concentrated team that's, trying to take it out. So it's not even going to last that long in that skirmisher role. And all it can do at that point is either retreat or use the Reef Slider, which is probably just going to get it splatted a lot of the time. And then, almost dead last, I'm going to put the Neo Clash. I see no reason to use this thing. The chump buff is definitely better for it, but just no part of this kit is really particularly good. The main weapon is one of the weakest main weapons in the game, and then it's got the super chumps, which, like we've talked about, are a little bit underpowered. And what the heck is this thing trying to even do with a curling bomb? Who's getting flanked by Clash Blasters? Who's getting, ratted out by Clash Blasters? It's just a huge mismatch with the kit. It's not able to really move in that aggressively with that. If you see that coming, that's a really predictable attack. It's not that threatening. It's easy to shoot this player as soon as they stand up for the ink to reveal themselves, because at that point, they have to just walk at you slowly while waiting for their weapon to do damage very slowly. So, one of the worst weapons in the game, but there is one down here in Shadow Realm tier. I had to put a gap between the Clash Neo and where it's at, because, as we all know, this is just the worst weapon in all of Splatoon 3. No reason whatsoever. Look at how high tier this weapon is, and it's so functionally similar. But when you pick this, you're opting in for just a much worse aesthetic experience, and that's really what we're all here for at the end of the day. We're here to have fun. We're here to enjoy ourselves, and you're just going to have a lot more fun with this funky-looking, swirly Super Soaker thing than you are with this real gun-looking thing. We're just silly kids and squids. This is the one we're here for, right? We're not here for this guy right here. So there's my list. I'm not taking very hard line stances on a lot of the viable weapons, because I think a lot of these can definitely work. But I wanted to show that I think that right now, what's way more important, especially for the people who are going to be really watching this tier list, is not so much which are the strongest pieces to put into a comp, it's how do those pieces fit together. What weaknesses does one piece have that I need to compensate for with another piece? And to kind of look into the pool of weapons that people are considering playing, consider the challenges you're going to face, consider what holes you have in your comp, and think which of these options is going to be the best fit to fill that. It's probably the healthiest state, in my opinion, that the metagame has been in yet. I'm really looking forward to seeing what future tournaments are going to look like on this patch and in future patches, because this is shaping up to be a lot healthier, and while we're moving there excruciatingly slowly, I think that there are a lot of these weapons that have needed buffs or needed new kits for such a long time, and just have not been getting them, which is really frustrating, because a lot of these, I don't think it's any any surprise to anyone who's following competitive play or even probably casual play to see that a lot of these are struggling, that a lot of these are unpopular, but they're not getting fixes. And instead we're getting like shooter buffs, which we really didn't need, honestly. Like, I won't complain about it, in part because it's an accuracy buff, and it makes it more so that you and your skill are going to shine through the weapon. But, like, you could have given that accuracy buff to a blaster or something, right? Like, you could have... There are a lot of things that they could be doing for the weaker weapons that it feels like they're going under the radar a little bit. Even so, there are more options that I think you can run at top-level Splatoon right now than there have ever been. I'm excited for that. I hope you guys are too. And I'm looking forward, again, to being able to see what the top players can do with the more unique set of tools that they've got at their disposal now.